Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to CEC live lecture. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further with our series on basic sociology. In our previous session we discussed on micro sociology in detail, and we promised to you that we would be conducting one more session on micro sociology. So here we are with our next session on micro sociology, and for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is from Center for Study of Sociological System, JNU. And dear friends, if you want to ask questions from Professor Maitri Chaudhary on today's topic, then you can call us right in the CEC studio through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. Dear friends, I request you to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture so that you could have the deep insight into today's topic, and afterwards we promise to solve your queries. So I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Let's welcome our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, and let's try to understand today's topic in detail. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
So hello again. We meet to discuss micro-sociology in continuation with my earlier class, which was on Micro-Sociology 1 with a specific focus on Herbert Mead. My focus today would be on Goffman and Garfinkel. But before I start discussing the specific features of Goffman's theory, what I would like to reiterate is the close relationship that exists between micro-sociology and macro-sociology. It's related also to the fundamental question that I've tried to emphasize right through my discussions, the fact that why do we have theory? We have theory in order to understand the complexity which exists in a society, extremely difficult to be gauged through direct perception or direct looking, because the whole question is when we observe, there is a whole gamut of things which we can observe and select. There are things which we cannot see at that surface. So there has to be certain kind of procedures or ways or frameworks or perspectives through which we study social phenomena. As iterated earlier, the early sociologists, the classical sociologists, for them, the focus was greatly on macro structures. So in that sense, we can probably define them as macro sociologists, interested in questions of the overarching structures, institutions in societies, of questions of class, questions of race, caste, gender, questions of institutions like the polity, economy, family and kinship and marriage, education, the kind of structures which impinge upon people and have a certain direct bearing upon the manner in which individuals are socialized and brought about. Micro-sociologists, as mentioned earlier, have a slightly different take. What they are interested in is not only in the question which Durkheim asked by introducing the concept of social fact, or what Parsons addressed the question by introducing the concept of social order. They are asking the question, how is that order produced and reproduced by individuals in society? They are paying attention to the fact that we as individuals are not passive victims of the social structure. We have agencies, we have minds of our own, and our abilities to negotiate, make sense of, interact, and reproduce the society in some senses in the manner in which we inherit, but in some senses in a manner which may be a little different from what we inherit. So it's very important for you to realize that the macro and the micro are not dichotomous entities. Their focus is definitely different, but the micro would not be possible without the macro structures within which we exist. So I, as an individual, today, as I talk to you, am speaking. This conversation or this talk are the kind of interests that micro-sociologists like Garfinkel or Goffman would be. Why am I speaking the way I am doing? What kind of examples am I bringing about? And what you, in turn, would be understanding, responding, maybe differing as you receive what the message that I communicate. This is the microsphere within which we exist. However, the macro structures, the educational system, the syllabi that you are given, which I have to cover, those are macro structures within which we as micro individuals operate. So the two are very, very closely interlinked. The micro sociologists, as you had already noticed, are very interested in the role of language, in the role of symbols, in the role of signs, in the manner in which we communicate, conversations, tacit conventions, what we do not do, how I behave as I speak, what I do at home, maybe in my kitchen, may be completely different. That is, there are contexts within which people behave. The situational contexts are extremely significant for micro-sociologists, be it a sociologist like Goffman or a sociologist like Garfinkel. The emphasis over here is that we as individual beings are agential beings. We construct and negotiate the reality within which we are. And this perspective of the micro-sociologist has a certain bearing on the kind of methods which they adopt and the empirical focal object of inquiry which they choose to study. So as we go into details about what Goffman studied or what Garfinkel articulated, you would notice the emphasis on smaller groups, individual behavior, communication between one and the other. If you remember in the discussion of me, the question of the significant the other, the question of the I and the me, the question of language, and most importantly, the question of a shared reality which we as subjects in this society share between us, share between yourselves and us, myself, as I am located here today as I speak. I begin with Harold Garfinkel. As you would be aware that I pay a lot of attention to the context and the dates within which they functioned and they wrote. Harold Garfinkel was born in 1917. He passed as late as 2011. In that extent, he is truly a 20th century product. He was an American. Both Goffman and Garfinkel, though they may have had Canadian-American past, but were primarily known as American sociologists. So the context, unlike the classical sociologists, is the United States of America. Unlike the classical sociologists, is not so much 19th century, but primarily 20th century. What did the theory which Harold Garfinkel articulate or theorize called? It was called ethnomethodology. All of you would be familiar with this term, ethnomethodology. What does ethnomethodology means? It is a particular method to study how people make sense of what others say and do in the course of everyday social interaction. I would like to iterate over here that not only were micro-sociologists interested in group interaction, in groups, in interaction, but they were also interested in the ordinary, everyday interaction which we perform on an everyday basis. Ethnomethodology is concerned with the ethnomethods by means of which human beings sustain meaningful interactions with one another. Ethnomethodology is the study of the folk or the lay methods, the methods which people use to make sense of what others do and particularly what they say. We all apply these methods. Usually we apply these methods not very self-consciously. We apply having not given any conscious attention to them. Often we can only make sense of what is said in conversation if we know the social context which does not appear in the words themselves. So Harold Garfinkel had a great emphasis on conversations. What he's trying to argue is that though we are not aware of it, though we are not fully conscious about it, each of us as members of a society have learned the skills to engage with the others. We have learned to know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, what can be done in a particular situation and what cannot be done in a particular situation. These learnings, these understandings are what Garfinkel often calls tacit conventions. Tacit because they are not stated clearly. They are tacit because they are not spelt out. Tacit very often even to ourselves because we do not think about it. We in a certain sense do it, and I use this word carefully, not mechanically like a robo, but in a skillful deployment of a certain way of behaving which we have learned as members of society. I'm going to give many examples, some directly from the examples which Garfinkel chose, some from examples which you and I can think about as we converse. For example, if you have a conversation between A and B, A says hot, cold or normal, and B says no thank you. A says hot, cold or normal, and B says no thank you. Now if you look at just the words hot, cold, normal and the response no thank you, it doesn't mean anything. The words don't mean anything. But if you put it in their context and say A is asking that would you like to drink some water, and in the context of drinking water is asking do you want hot water or cold water or normal water, and B says I don't want water, no thank you. Now when I spell it out, when I explain it, you will understand that there are a lot of taken for granted cues with which we operate in everyday conversation. This is something which Garfinkel uses the term indexical or indexicality, that those are the situated contexts. You can have words like here, now, there, which in themselves do not mean anything, but refer to the context, the specific context within which the conversation takes place. So Garfinkel, through ethnomethodology, was trying to show the hidden rules which operate in our everyday interaction. The interesting things are that we know how to use the rules, but we do not know how to explain or discover the rules. These are because therefore they are called tacit conventions. But Garfinkel wanted through a series of experimentation to expose or show how exactly does this maintenance of order by individuals and groups take place in concrete situations. I'll give one more example, and I borrow this example from Anthony Giddens' book on sociology. There's a conversation here again between one person and the other, person A and person B. Now person A says, I have a 14-year-old son. B says, well, that's all right. A says, I also have a dog. B says, oh, I'm sorry. Now again I repeat, A says, I have a 14-year-old son. B says, well, that's all right. A says, I also have a dog. B says, oh, I'm sorry. Now, what do you think is happening here? What is the relation between the speakers? If you just hear the words, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense why they are saying this. What is the connection between A and B? And why is the 14-year-old son all right, but a dog makes the other person says, no, I'm sorry. It becomes clear when we make explicit the situation within which this conversation is taking place. The conversation, Giddens writes, is taking place between a prospective tenant and a landlord. And once you know the conversation is between a prospective tenant and a landlord, it makes sense that the landlord doesn't mind having a young boy in the household that he's renting out, but he does have a problem with a dog. If we don't know the social context, the responses of individual B seem to bear no relation to the statements of A. Part of the sense is in the words. This is what Garfinkel's idea of ethnomethodology is stating. Part of the sense is in the words, and part is in the way in which the social context structures what is social. So there are two aspects, one in the words itself, the meaning that they hold, but the other is the context within which this meaning gets performed. So the symbol or the gesture is not enough. You have to also understand the social context within which it takes place. As I said before, to all micro-sociologists, whether it be Garfinkel or Goffman, what is very, very important is the existence of shared understanding between people who interact in society. This is the very complicated shared understanding in knowledge which is brought into play by those who are involved, by those who are interacting here. This, what you may feel is just small talk. What's the big deal? It's just small talk, the kind of conversations which we have every day. But it is so complex that it has so far proved impossible to program even the most sophisticated computers to converse with human beings. We know how to strategize, we know how to trick, we know how to avoid a particular kind of question or query which may come on our way. We, in that sense, are truly agential individuals skilled in the art of conversation. And remember, as we converse, you are interacting with the other. You have a sense of what the other is saying. Now, the words used in ordinary talk do not always, therefore, have a precise meaning. Hot, cold, normal have certain kind of meanings, but the precision or the meaning, the actual meaning which they elicit or communicate can only come alive in a context. We fix what we want to say through the unstated assumptions that back it. So again, I'm flagging off certain kind of categories which ethnomethodologists use. Once I remember one was the whole question of shared understanding, indexicality, situated context, and now I add unstated assumptions that back it up. What do we mean by unstated? Remember, we use the word tacit conventions. Tacit means not spelt out. Conventions are there, but this is so it's hidden. It is almost part of ourselves. And what is unstated assumptions? That we do not spell it out. We do not say, look, Garfinkel said this or that. But unstated assumptions are there as we interact in very ordinary, normal, everyday life. I'll give an example that this conversation is between a husband and a wife, and the husband asks, what did you do today? At the end of the day, the husband asks the wife, what did you do today? Now, what should the wife reply? If the wife says, I got up in the morning, I had a bath, I had a breakfast, I made tea, that's not the answer that the husband is expecting. So they have a certain unstated understanding or unstated assumption that when I'm asking you, what did you do today? I want to know that what did you do when we were not together, when I went off to work, or did you do something interesting? There are certain unstated assumptions, not spelt out, not explicitly stated by the husband, but understood by the wife. Likewise, you meet a friend and you ask, what did you do yesterday? Now again, if the friend says, oh, I got up, I had a bath, I had tea, that is not the answer that you're expecting. Both you and your friend know the context of what you did yesterday that you are referring to. Keeping this in mind, Garfinkel tried a certain set of experiments through his students. And his students were asked that, look, you must try an experiment in ordinary conversations and push them. Push those conversations and make the persons involved in the conversation state explicitly what they mean. Now, the students were asked to engage a friend or a relative in conversation and to insist that casual remarks or general comment be actually pursued to make their meaning precise. Now, if someone said, have a nice day, which is a very common way by which people converse in the West and increasingly in the urban city centers in Delhi, that have a nice day, urban centers in India, a student is supposed to respond as thank you, have a nice day, and you say thank you, or you say have a nice day too. This is a tacit convention that you know what that person is saying and you're responding likewise. But what happens if when somebody says have a nice day, you respond nice? In what sense? What do you mean exactly? Which part of the day do you mean? Should it mean? Now, if you say something like that, usually what happens is that the other person gets extremely frustrated, extremely angered. It disrupts the flow of conversation. This is what Garfinkel calls breaching. Breaching. That is, it breaks the trust which is there in the manner in which a conversation is conducted with certain tacit conventions and shared unstated assumptions. I give another example now directly from Garfinkel. How are you? Says A. B says, how am I in regard to what? My health, my finance, my school, my peace of mind, my what? And the other person who had made this question, how are you, in good spirit, gets very, very angry, red in the face, suddenly out of control, and says, look, I was just trying to be polite. Frankly, I don't care a damn how you are. This is called breaching. It breaches tacit conventions. Why do people, now Garfinkel, through that experiment, raises this question, why do people get upset when apparently minor conventions of talk are not followed? And Garfinkel's answer is that the stability and meaningfulness of our daily life depend on the sharing of unstated cultural assumptions about what is said and why. That is, we share a cultural world within which we share unstated assumptions, tacit conventions. We do not speak about it, but we know it. If we weren't able to take these for granted, meaningful communication would be impossible. So what seems at first sight to be very unimportant conventions of talk turn out to be fundamental to the very fabric of social life. We can't function. If I came here and you're expecting me to speak on micro sociology and I decide to describe to you what I did in my garden, there is a serious breaching. There is a breaching of what conventions would be. So here are the many kinds of examples which Garfinkel uses to explain. He also gives examples of individuals who may violate or use these tacit conventions to disrupt. Now, suppose you have an example of a conversation between a parent and a teenager, and the parent says, "Where are you going?" The teenager says, "Out." "Where are you going to?" And what are you going to do? The teenager says, "Nothing." What is the teenager trying to communicate? The teenager is trying to communicate to the parent that please don't bother me, stay out, it's not of your business, Or you may have a situation where somebody says, that, "Oh, where are you going?" And the person says, "I'm going nowhere, I'm going crazy." Now, these are the clever ways by which we manipulate our conversations. These are the skillful ways by which we do it, by which we know to disrupt it. Does this mean that the macro structures do not impinge on the manner in which we skillfully manage our private conversations? No, not at all. Categories like class, categories like race, categories like gender, age do have a role to play. That is, in a certain sense, conversation between men and women may be very differently played out depending upon the cultural context within which it is being played out, including maybe a cultural context where women and men are not supposed to be talking, properly. This is a point I'll be carrying on in the next lecture when I emphasize on Goffman. Thank you. So we continue now our discussion on micro-sociology, and here now in this session my focus will be on Erving Goffman, 1922 to 1982. Like I mentioned before, very much 20th century. He was a Canadian American sociologist, and Erving Goffman is very often known by an approach which is called dramaturgical approach. Very simply, it is a perspective which tries to look at social life as like a theatre or a drama. There are certain commonalities which mark all micro-sociologists: shared understanding between members of society, emphasis on language, emphasis on symbol, emphasis on interaction, emphasis on gestures, body movements, emphasis on tacit conventions, emphasis on the agential nature of human beings to learn and operate to function in certain kind of society. There is a great focus on the body and speech in interaction. Very often in syllabi, they all club together as symbolic interactionism. This should not be taken too literally, because symbolic interactionism as a perspective was developed in a very specific context. But what is common to whether it's a Mead or a Goffman or a Garfinkel is an emphasis on interactionism and on symbols, which does not necessarily mean that they have all used the term symbolic interactionism. Most of us, the argument would go as articulated by Goffman, without realizing it, keeps a very tight control over facial expression, bodily posture, and the movement in the course of our daily interaction with others. We also organize our activities in the context of social life to achieve the same ends as we do our conduct our everyday life and encounter or go through various kinds of encounters with other people. This seems me surprising. In fact, in a certain sense, it's like when people tell you to meditate or hold your breath, you suddenly realize that you're not able to hold your breath or control your breath, or whereas when you're not aware, you are breathing naturally. You're not even aware of it. In certain senses, our cues, or the manner in which you know what to say, what not to say, where to say, we have learned those cues are so deeply socialized in us, become part of us, that we not only use them, but sometimes we actually strategize and use them. We know how this works. So in order to do that, he says that he introduces this term encounters. What is an encounter? He says that encounters are situations when individuals or groups meet each other, and he distinguishes between two kinds of encounters or interaction. One is an unfocused interaction. Unfocused interaction with others occurs whenever individuals exhibit mutual awareness of one another but do not directly focus upon the other. And he gives many examples. Say, for example, you are in a crowd. You are aware about others who are around you. You're attentive to them, but in an unfocused way. Maybe you gone to a cinema hall. You are there outside waiting to go in. You're aware of the others, but it's not focused. It is what he calls unfocused attention, as contrasted with what Goffman calls focused interaction. Focused interaction occurs when individuals directly attend to what others say or do. So when you are unfocusedly looking around in the hall outside the cinema, you may have noticed somebody you think you have recognized, but you retain a body language which suggests not a focused interaction, which does not give any indication that you have actually recognized, or you're trying to send a certain kind of gesture. This focused interaction occurs, he says, against the background of unfocused interaction. So he says that when supposing an encounters, he again uses another word, needs opening, which indicate that civil inattention is being discarded. I sort of would like to go through some of these concepts again so that you understand what is being done. What is being done is what all of us do every day. He's just that he's spelling it out, that we are there, maybe in a conference hall, we enter we don't immediately know who is there. So there is a certain unfocused attention. We're trying to make sense of who is there and who's not there. Then it's a civil inattention. We know what kind of expression we should have in our face when you're sitting there. And then when we recognize somebody, what he calls, it's an opening that you look at that person, you make eye contact. And when you make the eye contact, it's a little tentative, a little ambiguous. You're not very sure that you recognize that person, but you are sort of signaling in an unambiguous way that maybe I know you. And if the other person responds, then you move into direct focused interaction. So you have an encounter, you have an unfocused interaction, what he would call civil inattention, then you have an opening, and then you have a focused interaction. In a focused interaction, each person communicates as much by facial expression as gestures, as by the words actually exchanged. Here the role of body language becomes extremely important. That is, we communicate not only through words, we also communicate through gestures. We communicate through facial expressions. Whether we find something distasteful, we can extend remoteness, we can communicate warmth and cordiality. It's a package deal through which we communicate. Goffman says that the expressions that we have, sometimes we give away that, look, I am a little angry, and I express that anger directly, or I'm maybe showing that I'm extremely happy and very happy to meet certain point, and that's my individual give, that I am deliberately controlling that expression, that I'm very, very happy to meet you. But he makes a distinction between the individual expression given and that give off. That is, while I may be trying to communicate that I am extremely happy to meet A or B or C, the other person senses something in my body language which is a giveaway that maybe I'm not particularly happy and that I'm just making an impression management. So this is something which Goffman tries to show that, look, that people are so skilled in interaction. There are so many ways by people negotiate, communicate that how conversation or interaction is possible. He now introduces another category, the category of markers, or what Goffman called brackets, which distinguish each episode of focused interaction from the one before and from uninformed, unfocused interaction in the background. He gives an example, what do you mean by markers? And he gives an example, maybe all of you have seen that. Maybe you go to a wedding, or maybe it's a get-together. And in that get-together, you have a group of people who are huddled together, conversing with each other, like a semicircle or almost a circle, facing each other, conversing. And even as you enter, you know that you cannot intrude into that group without appearing to be rude. There was something about the way they're circling and talking to each other which makes you an outsider, somebody who's not an in-member of the communication which is taking place over there. He says that these are the brackets. The brackets, like we use brackets in sentences, these are the brackets by which you are suggesting that, look, you're not part of this conversation, and that if you want to enter it, there will be again an opening, and with that opening you will enter, and maybe the conversation that you were having before that person entered is changed completely. That you decide to move on to another conversation which you feel is more appropriate once that other person comes in. So he says these are recognized devices which people use. And since, as you remember, he's very often called a person whose approach is called dramaturgical, that is borrowing from the model of the theatre, you have, like in a theatre, you have a certain formal occasion, a recognized device. You go to a play, what happens? There is lights on, you sit down, the lights go off. And when the lights go off, the curtains go up. There are cues. And once the curtains go up, you enter a different world. But when the play is over, the curtains go down and the lights come on. So just like in a theatre, there are devices there are specific devices, recognized shared devices, which tell you that, look, now this has begun, now this is ended. So you have likewise in our everyday interaction certain of these markers. Then he gives a certain example by what he means, that the manner in which we know how to negotiate and behave in different circumstances or different situations. For example, you are in a lift in a building in many of the cities which inhabit our country, and in a lift you're not supposed to be over the top conversing with others, so you may have an exaggerated not listening, not looking pose. You stare straight at the wall, you stare at the back of somebody's head. That is, in a certain sense, it's a certain kind of impression management. You don't want to give the impression that you may be looking into somebody or that you're overhearing. So there is a certain fixed way of looking and behaving in a lift. When a very little child enters the lift, that little child's behavior disrupts that certain stiffness, because perhaps the child has not yet learned that in this context he has to behave in a particular manner. All of you are probably familiar with this concept. Impression management is used very often nowadays in our everyday life, in management courses. Goffman was one of the early thinkers who used this term, impression management. And again, he borrows from the theater the idea of roles and statuses, and he says that in particular contexts we have to behave in a particular fashion. That as I am speaking to you, for example, I have a certain status as the lecturer today, and this is the role that I am performing, assuming that I have an audience who is listening to me. It's a little difficult because the context of which Goffman was trying to talk about was face-to-face, where I can see you, you can see me, we are interacting, gauging, cueing. Here, only from the shared world that we share, I can have a sense of perhaps you are thinking this, or perhaps you are planning to ask a particular kind of question. I'll come to this point later of how technology, internet, Skype, satellite television like the one which we're using today have transformed interaction. But to go back, Goffman uses the concept impression management. He uses the concept of roles, acting in specific ways to which are specific to that particular status that you occupy, and the manner in which we learn how to respond to the other depending upon our specific status. Here, he introduces another concept which is extremely interesting, the concept of master status, which takes us back to the relationship of macro sociology and micro sociology, a point which I've been emphasizing right through, that the macro and micro are not dichotomous, antithetical perspective. The macro impinges on us, and the most important categories of master status in society, what he's trying to say that in any society there are certain master status which are the dominant forms of status order which exists. For example, in most societies which are class-based, in a feudal society, class base is usually ascribed, that you are born maybe as a zamindar, or you're born as a serf, maybe you're born as a Brahmin, or you're born as a Dalit. Those are ascribed status. And in a feudal society, it is ascribed status which is the master status. In such societies like modern capitalist societies, gender is also a master status. Whether you are a man or a woman is extremely important in defining, or a third gender, in defining how interaction should be conducted. That is extremely important. That in many traditional societies, women are not supposed to speak. Women are not supposed to have any kind of opinion. So in that kind of society, it destabilizes. And if you do not know that in that society, if you're an outsider to the society, you may make many faux pas because you do not know what are the tacit conventions, what are the unstated shared assumptions which allow and make possible an intelligent, skillful conversation or interaction from taking place. So master status remain important, and master status refer to structural categories, whether it is gender, whether it is race, whether it's class, whether it's nationality, whether you come from a dominant Western country or whether you come from a country which has gone through colonization, has left its mark, of people who maybe continue to have a colonized mind many, many years after colonialism has ended. It depends a lot on those macro structures, what your microstructures would be. Age could be a master status in certain kind of societies, simple societies. So the fact that you have to be deferential to those who are older to you, that being senior is a matter of prestige. This changes from one society to the other. I recall a time when my father had not even reached 40, and 40 was supposed to be a significant age, but he wanted to tell everybody that he had reached 40 because that gave him a certain kind of age-related status. It can change in a society like modern consumer-oriented society with a focus on looking young and beautiful all the time, where you may be apologetic about looking old, or you may feel that looking old is a disadvantage. So these master status are historical, are structural, are macro. But it is within those contexts of the macro structure or macro history that the micro games of conversation and interaction are played out. We now come pushing the whole analogy of the theatre or the drama to the concept of regions. The concept of region is what Goffman talks about, the front region and the back region. Front regions are social occasions or encounter in which individuals act out formal roles. They are on stage performance. That look, now that I am speaking and giving this lecture, I have to function within a front region. I am expected to behave as a sociologist giving a lecture ought to behave. There is a certain degree of formality, a certain degree of clothes, gestures, conversational styles which are expected of the status and the role when you are playing out in the front region. When I go back and maybe when this talk ends, I am more relaxed, I am more willing to do certain things in a more casual fashion. Just like the front stage and the back stage of a theatre is different. When the lights go off and the curtain goes up and you have to start performing, you are completely on alert for the performance. When the stage falls, when the curtain comes down and you go back, you suddenly relax. You relax, you don't sit in the same way, you may be speaking in a language which is maybe more slangish and more informal than the language which you are using on stage. So the backstage is different. Now Goffman adds a more complicated term over here about the question that how people negotiate or how people are agents aware about these tacit conventions, and he talks about teamwork. And here there's two very interesting examples given. And I don't know whether the example is given by Giddens or drawn from Goffman, but the examples are interesting that you may have two politicians belonging to the same political party who don't like each other, but they come on television and they have to put forward a certain impression management, that is the front stage, and maybe they don't speak after the episode is over. Or maybe when a husband and a wife are fighting, but when the neighbor comes in, they have to put up an appearance because suddenly from the back region, you are in the front region. Back regions are places where people assemble the props and prepare themselves for interaction in the formal setting, like the backstage of a theatre. In these contexts, there are other concepts which become very, very important, and also important to flag off the manner in which the macro and the micro play out. For example, the concept of personal space, which is again very, very culture specific, that in the West, in industrialized Western countries, they have a very, very, maybe if one wants to use the word, evolved sense of what constitutes their personal space. They don't like encroachment on the personal space. Very often when you have read novels written by people whose parents belonged to our country, but who migrated maybe to the United States, maybe to England, and whose children grew up in a more American or European cultural sensitivity, and they often mention that how when they come back to India, parents or grandparents or uncles or aunts would insist that have this food or have that food, and they would feel that they're encroaching upon my personal space. They are not appreciating that I do not want to wish to do that. Here what is happening is that the shared understanding between the interacting members in a intimate personal space is itself threatened, because the individuals who happen to be family members are individuals who have grown up in very different contexts. So their cultural presuppositions are different. Such contestations or tensions become even more intense in the contemporary period of globalization. So very often you will have manuals for businessmen who would tell you that, look, if you want to do business in India, this is what you ought to do, or if you want to do business in China, this you must know that their cultural cues are different from here. Interactions here in the personal is also different depending on time and space. Even within the house, the drawing room may be a more formal setting than in your bedroom. Interesting here is not just space, but the question of clock time. And clock time, which you may feel is so normal that you know that this talk would come at 2 o'clock, clock time seems so naturalized, is also something which is historical. Clock time is something which was introduced with modernity, with the kind of developments which we talked about in our talk on the emergence and growth of sociology, when we talked about classical sociology. Clock time today is a global standard time. It was not always so. Just like we didn't always have one calendar. Even now in India we have many calendars, but officially we go with one time. The standard time or the clock time changes. Interestingly, many of you may be already knowing it, during British colonialism, when they started the tea gardens in Assam, where the sun rises much earlier than it would rise in, say, Delhi or Bombay, they introduced a tea garden time, the plantation time, because that was more suited to the work, everyday work patterns and to the question of labor maximization. Today, in the contemporary period where India became a hub for outsourcing, you're very familiar that we have outsourced, sectors where people work 24/7, and in the service sector, because they're catering to customers maybe in America or Europe, which could be 12 hours behind the time that we function. So you have a time which becomes different. So technology and social life changes the orientation within which we operate. This becomes extremely important in the contemporary context. It becomes extremely important and somehow both poignant and remarkable in the situation in which we are today, where classroom interaction was supposed to be face-to-face. So when I teach in my real classroom, I know whether a student is bored or not bored. I know when I have sort of deviated from what I was trying to say. I can see interest in somebody's eye. Those are cues which I recognize and I can respond. Now, when I speak here today, I have none of those cues. So I have to just imagine what could be possibly the kind of queries or responses that I have. It has transformed interaction in a fundamental fashion. It has changed communication in a fundamental fashion. For sociologists, at one point of time, perhaps, Goffman and Garfinkel's attempt to understand the everyday, the manner in which we run our lives, may seem to have not been directly relevant to macro-sociological topics. I don't think the situation is the same today, because what has happened today is communication has become central in our lives. Communication has redefined both the public and the private of our lives, both the public and the personal. You all are young people. I still do not know, and I'm not very comfortable with Facebook, but all of you would probably have Facebook accounts. Both political, public, personal, intimate issues are often mediated through the Facebook. What are the implications of that? What are the implications of a social which gets completely constructed by communication and media? What are the implications of public good, personal life, questions, philosophical questions of what kind of life are we talking about? What happens when communication becomes instantaneous? These are questions which are relevant for you to examine. Because whenever we talk about theories, don't think about sociology just as a dead syllabi which you must cover because you have to sit for an examination. This is a skill for life. And people like Garfinkel, the micro sociologists, have a great deal to offer for us in our everyday life. Thank you very much.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so
Thank
much for giving us a productive session on micro sociology. And dear friends, we believe that your feedbacks are very, very important for us. So do write to us at info.cec@nice.in, as well as your questions are very, very important for us, because we believe that solving your queries are the part of our lectures only. So if you have any queries, do write to us. We'll try to give answers to your queries when next time Professor Maitri Chaudhary visits our studio. Ma'am, what are we going to study next in the forthcoming sessions?
I don't think I'll be taking a course.
Yes, we'll be, dear friends, we'll be
more on theory.
Yes, definitely, dear friends. We would be conducting more sessions on the series Basic Sociology, as we have ample of lectures lined up for you in the future, and we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you. So if you want to see the lectures which have already been conducted, the lectures are there. So keep watching us, keep writing us. We would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing more. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.